Hi, I'm Cort Savage, and welcome back to Basic Sculpture. You'll remember last time we left off at Jana Sturbach's meat dress and the 5 primary concerns of this course: form, material, process, craft, and content. And currently, you're wrestling with these concerns through the lens of Erwin Wurm. In this video, we'll continue our discussion of content, the variety of meanings, references, and implications that may or may not be present in a sculpture. First, I'll share 3 suggestions I've learned are essential in working with content in art. Second, I'll share a bit more about Marcel Duchamp, who was mentioned in the conceptual art video as making conceptual art way before it was cool. Third, I'll share a few artistic movements and artists who've been highly influenced by Duchamp's Readymades. To begin, let me share 3 premises I've found important in thinking about content in sculpture. Premise 1. Know the difference between intent and content. Intent is what you want, wish, or would claim your sculpture means or implies. Content, by contrast, is what the society and culture claims it means or implies. The sad news is that you may deeply believe in what you want your sculpture to mean, but it may mean something very different to others, or it may not even reflect your intent at all. The good news is that viewers will often bring really interesting content to your work that you never imagined. Here's a sculpture of mine that's currently on exhibit. It's a fully loaded and cocked revolver encased in an archival rubber bands with an adjacent X-ray. My intent was to enter the question of asking, when is a threat real and when is it simply a perception? And how do we distinguish one from the other? Viewers have come back to me with radically different interpretations of the work's content, some of which I agree with and some of which I don't. Those conversations questioning the work's content, though, may actually be far more important than anything that was my original intent. Premise 2. Rather than asking, what does it mean, consider asking, does it inspire my or the viewer's curiosity? Setting up a context that invites conversation may be more important than communicating a specific or logical message. If the viewer is made curious, they are more likely to engage with the work. A declarative statement may be simply propaganda, where an artistic statement opens the mind to a multiplicity of possibilities, curiosities, and conversation. Remember this work by Jean Shin? I understand the numbers of pill containers as a symbol of a pervasive pharmaceutical culture. I'm less clear what the meaning might be of presenting them as stalactites and stalagmites or organic forms growing toward each other. I don't understand it, but boy, am I made curious about it, and I want to talk to others about it. That work that generates intrigue and encourages viewers to be drawn in to know more, that's on the right path. Premise 3. Embrace contradiction. Contradiction, contrast, and tension all breathe life into an artwork. As human beings, we're full of contradiction, so why shouldn't art do the same? So when you encounter a moment of contradiction, rather than run away from it or try to force it into some kind of binary solution, you can simply present the contradictions, and because that is the human condition. Remember Jana Sturbach's sculpture, Vanitas Meat Dress for an Albino Anorexic? According to the artist, it's a work about the contrast between bodily vanity and bodily decomposition. Even greater contradiction and tension was added by placing the sculpture adjacent to a photo of a young woman wearing the dress and adding a provocative title. Rather than trying to generate resolution, the work's contradictions are where its power resides. Well, hopefully these premises will help you facilitate some content in your own sculpture. But now let's move on and take a trip down the historical rabbit hole. The year is 1902, where a painter is intrigued by the promises of Impressionist painting. Then the painter moves to explore the promises of Post-Impressionist painting. Then the painter shifts to the promises of Fauvist painting, and then to investigating the promises of Cubist painting, and finally to fusing Cubist concepts with those of Italian Futurist painting, where we realize the painter is Marcel Duchamp. Duchamp explains, I forced myself to contradict myself in order to avoid conforming to my own taste. Duchamp knew his taste was not his, rather what his society, culture, and tradition told him his taste was supposed to be. So after he painted his way through his culture's last 50 years of painting, he mustered the courage to question the very foundations of art making and wondered where he would arrive if he transcended everything about his culture's past tradition, taste, refinement, connoisseurship, and assumed truths about aesthetics. He arrived here, a bicycle wheel mounted upside down to a stool. Duchamp is quoted as saying, "My idea was to choose an object that wouldn't attract me either by its beauty or its ugliness. My goal was to find a point of indifference in looking at it." In other words, if Duchamp were to create something beautiful, he would simply be parroting his culture's status quo aesthetics. And if he created something ugly, he would again be parroting the inverse of his culture's status quo aesthetics. Either way, his thinking would be ruled by the past. The only way to find a new direction would begin with a circumstance that he viewed with total neutrality. Here's another Duchamp work, a common bottle rack for drying bottles that would have been available at many stores in Paris. Duchamp stated, "The creative act is not performed by the artist alone. The spectator brings the work into contact with the external world by deciphering and interpreting its inner qualifications, and thus adds his contribution to the creative act." Meaning, the viewer not only has a central role to play in determining the content of an artwork, content is literally birthed through the viewer. Or most famously this, a work titled Fountain, a urinal signed and turned on its side. Duchamp stated, "Art has absolutely no existence as veracity, as truth. People speak of it in great religious reverence. I'm afraid I am an agnostic when it comes to art. I don't believe in it with all the mystical trimmings." Suggesting aesthetic principles are not absolutes. They are there to be interrogated rather than worshipped. Actually, scholars increasingly believe that Fountain was not submitted for exhibition by Duchamp at all, but by another Dada artist, Elsa Hildegard Baroness von Freytag Loringhoven. When submitted for exhibition, it was originally rejected, and Duchamp, a board member of the arts organization sponsoring the exhibition, claimed the work as his in order to be sure it would be exhibited. Since that time, Duchamp has taken credit for it. Duchamp referred to these works as Readymades, everyday objects selected by the artist, removed from their everyday contexts, and placed in an art gallery or museum, which recontextualizes the object as art. There was also another category of ready-made assisted, a ready-made that has been altered or combined with another ready-made. Now, to be clear, not all of Duchamp's works were ready-mades. This is a work entitled The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Even, commonly known as the large glass. It's a hybridization of drawing, painting, and sculpture, which he declared finished only after it was shipped and arrived shattered to pieces, which he then painstakingly reconstructed over years. So why would this sud-soaked man create such unconventional and irreverent art? Well, to understand that, we have to consider how his world would have changed between the beginning and end of World War I. World War I was the introduction of mechanized warfare, the machine gun, the tank, protracted trench warfare, chemical weapons. For the first time, Europeans conceived of a possibility that they could actually exterminate themselves off the planet. Or picture this. After the war, 1 out of 3 men in the streets of Paris and Berlin were either amputees or exhibited the results of the first attempts at cosmetic reconstructive surgery. I know it's hard to look at. Cities that only a few years earlier were filled with genteel Sunday afternoon strolls were now filled with money made so worthless by hyperinflation it was burned to heat houses or used to make kites. That's a loaf of bread with a price tag of 4.6 million marks. The world made absolutely no sense, and Duchamp wanted art to reflect the reality of its historical moment. So what was the content of Duchamp's sculpture? What were its meanings, its references, and its implications? First, any object can potentially be a work of art or an art-making material. It made no sense in the 20th century to limit oneself by traditional materials like bronze or marble. Second, the primary importance of an artist is that of a thinker or philosopher rather than as a technical maker or craftsperson. The artist is the conceiver and may or may not be the creator. Technical skill was not essential. Third, the artist is the culturally selected determiner of what is or is not art. The artist's role as a selector of what is art is as significant as anything they physically make. Simply put, once a culture labels someone an artist, if that person says it is art, then it is art. Fourth, chance and random occurrence have as important a role to play in art making as intentional choices. Chance is as relevant as reason, logic, theory, or any kind of technical control. And finally, Duchamp's historical context suggests that if art were to reflect its time, it would have to be nonsensical or make no sense. In Duchamp's Paris, for art to make sense, it had to be completely different from anything anyone had ever seen. This core thinking is what defined the art movement known as Dada. Duchamp's Readymades were catalysts for ideas, as opposed to things of visual beauty to be admired. In other words, in the case of Readymades, the aesthetic experience doesn't take place in the eye of the beholder, but rather in the mind of the beholder. And that premise fundamentally altered how we perceive the role of content in art for the last 100 years. Okay, so that gives us some more context to work with. Thanks for going down the historical rabbit hole. Now, let's look at a few art movements and artists who use found objects used but not made by the artist in creating their larger works. The first movement I want to share is surrealism, abstraction inspired by the subconscious and dream imagery. This work by Merritt Oppenheim, Fur-Lined Teacup, viscerally inspires revulsion and attraction. Next is the movement pop art. Pop art was focused on elevating the common, mundane, and everyday, and blurring the lines that separate life from art. Robert Rauschenberg wanted to blur the line between life and art, so he took his bed off the floor, stuck it on the wall, and painted it. Next is Art Povera. This movement used found objects with an emphasis on living materials to examine time, entropy, mortality, and the memento mori. That's Latin translating as remember that you have to die. Janis Kounellis populated the gallery with living horses, which ate and pooped and attracted flies in the gallery for over the 30-day exhibition, commenting on ephemerality, time, and probably a few choice smells. And last, Fluxus, an art movement focused on intermedia, performance, anti-commercial art, and opening up definitions of what art can be. Joseph Beuys's work, Honey Pump, uses an electric motor to pump honey through a gigantic assemblage of pipes in the stairwell of a museum, symbolizing the circulation of life and flowing energy. Those are just a few of the art movements that have Marcel Duchamp at their core. Finally, let's look at a few contemporary sculptors who are also highly influenced by Duchamp and found objects. This is Annette Messager. She states, "Being an artist means forever healing your own wounds at the same time endlessly exposing them." This work knits sweaters and scarves for dead birds and bird-like forms, conveying metaphorically both the pain of loss and a sense of empathetic caring. Next is Jeff Koons. Koons uses found objects right out of the box to reference the purity of found objects prior to their actual use. At the same time, these ready-mades acerbically comment on the cold economics of art as a financial commodity and also an unromanticized art world economics. Here's a work by Willie Cole, one of his wind masks. It repurposes blow dryers and offers a contemporary interpretation of traditional African masks combined with more of a blue-collar goodwill aesthetic. Here is Damien Hirst's The Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. It confronts viewers with their own fear of death by placing them face-to-face with a 17-foot embalmed tiger shark. Here's a work by David Hammonds, and with one elegant assisted ready-made. he questions stereotypical myths about Black identity and inner-city culture. Likewise, Tara Donovan uses the simplest of everyday objects like plastic cups and clear shirt buttons to construct references and systems that link human manufacture with larger environmental systems and landscapes. This is a work by Ai Weiwei, which exposes government secrecy and honors the deaths of thousands of school children who died in a 2008 earthquake by using backpacks to spell out a statement quoted by a mother who lost her child. She lived happily for 7 years in this world. And lastly, Sonia Clark invites viewers to unweave a Confederate battle flag one thread at a time as a reference to reconciling the past, processing systemic racism, and representing bundles of threads as potential to write a new history. So, in review, what did we learn? We learned a few premises that might help you contend with content in your sculpture, such as knowing the difference between intent and content, asking, does what you are creating inspire curiosity in you and your viewer? And embracing contradiction as a way to generate interest and to reflect the reality of the human condition. We also looked at the historical emergence of the ready-made as a concept and how that has changed art making. And we looked at Marcel Duchamp and how his art was really just a reflection of the world around him. And finally, we looked at how a few contemporary artists have used found objects in their works. That's it for now, but I'll leave you with this question. Is this a work of Fluxus, Dada, or simply a man trying to circumvent the European travel ban? I'll see you next time in Basic Sculpture.